And I've been in dark rooms with guns and drugs many, many times. And like, oh, you took all that risk. You could have gotten hurt. Maybe, sure. But think about this. Think about the risk that those guys took. Coming to meet some white dude who is like all of a sudden coming into their world and seeing all this stuff, and they over time exposing me to it. I mean, think of that risk. And it was huge. Or think about the risk that guys took in that first boot camp I told you about, where you had leaders who had been shooting at each other. Mm-hmm. They were willing to come into a room with their just arch enemy, right? And they did it. Well, that tells me that they really wanted to have a better way in life, right?
Welcome to Second Act Stories, a podcast that profiles people who have made major life and career changes and are pursuing more rewarding lives in a second act. I'm your host today, Scott Merritt.
And I'm Andy Levine, a co-host of Second Act Stories. Scott, you made the trip down to Wilmington, North Carolina for today's story, and you interviewed a fellow named George Taylor. Tell us about that conversation.
Yeah, that's right. So George has been a serial entrepreneur his entire life, a software guy. He's a tech entrepreneur, started and sold off a whole bunch of companies. Well, several years ago, he had a traumatic experience that led him to found a brewery in Wilmington.
Okay, and I think what I understand makes the brewery unique is his employees. So why don't you share that with the group here?
Yeah, so TRU Colors Brewery, and TRU is spelled TRU, it stands for Truth, Responsibility, and Unity, employs only active gang members. How's that?
Gang members.
That's right. So guys who live a life of crime, but George's mission is to help them find their way to economic success and success in life through being employed at a company whose mission is to do just that. It's a really interesting story.
And we're going to hear it right now. Here's George Taylor's second act story.
I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, fairly normal upper middle class environment, I guess, and went to a boarding school up in Connecticut. And by the time I got to be, 22, got involved with computers. I was very fortunate and learned how to program, taught myself, and got pretty proficient at it. And so then by the time I was 23, I'd started a computer networking company and have since then always worked on my own. Always had startups. I've had 9 different startups, primarily in tech.
What industries were you focusing on with tech?
Back in the beginning, in the early 80s, I got an opportunity to work at a bank in New York called Manufacturers Hanover Trust. And what I learned is, in the 80s anyway, that banking was run on these huge computers, mainframes and mini computers. And at the time, I was a microcomputer PC kind of guy. I was like, man, couldn't we run a whole bank on one of these PCs? And so in 1985, we started a company called Anthem Software that created the world's first microcomputer-based banking system. And I've been in banking systems or banking software for another 10 or 15 years. And so for the most part, it's all been fintech kind of stuff.
So was that a personal interest of yours? Is that what drove you into that part of the tech world?
No. So I like creation. And people say, like, do you love financial software? Do you love beer software? Because I've been involved in that. But for the most part, I like the creation process. And if you look at my track record anyway, I usually will try to start something, grow it as quickly as we can, 5 to 7 years, and then exit. I'm not really particularly good at sticking around much beyond that.
In the early 90s, after selling one of his companies, George and his young family decided they'd had enough of freezing cold winters in the Northeast, and they set their sights on Wilmington, North Carolina. George's parents had retired there, and the beachy lifestyle appealed to them.
We started a banking software company in Wilmington in 94 or something like that. That's actually the one that ended up going public. And we did all the development here, but we had to relocate it to Orlando, Florida, which at the time was sort of the banking software hub of the country, because we just couldn't make it work in Wilmington.
Something happened that changed your life. What was that, and when did that happen?
Several years ago, we started a software company called Untapped, which is a fairly large sort of social network in the beer space. several million users and tens of thousands of businesses on the system.
Mm-hmm.
And about 5 years ago, while I was working at Untapped, there was a shooting, a drive-by, not far from my office. And at the time, I heard about it on the news, and they said it was gang-related, and someone apparently drove down the street and shot out their window at somebody. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know this happened in our city. It frankly pissed me off that somebody would be willing to drive down the streets of our city and wave a pistol at the car and shoot somebody. And so I wanted to understand. So I reached out to the DA, who's a friend of mine, and I was like, hey man, I'd like to meet whoever top gangster is, because this is bullshit and I don't get it. And so he reluctantly set that up. I met 3 guys that they had referred me to who they said had high status on the streets, and began talking to them about what was driving the violence and how all this worked and gangs and all this sort of thing. And I went into it thinking that if you're in a gang, gangs are bad, right? And if you're in a gang, then your primary role in life is to hurt people and sell drugs or something like that, right? What I learned very quickly is that's false. And that's not to say that there are not gang members doing violent things. There absolutely are. But the vast majority of gang members are in our schools. They're working jobs at fast food or grocery stores or whatever, not working at all. But the vast majority of them are not doing anything illegal. Secondly, like when you get to meet leadership, and what you learn is that they're not with the violence at all. They're very opposed to it. But that, it's difficult when people are on the streets and they're fighting with poverty and all sorts of trauma from their upbringing and this sort of thing. That's what causes violence. So the real cause of violence is not gangs, it's lack of economic opportunity and societal exclusion. And that's the driver. So, and that's really what kicked off TRU Colors was, okay, if it's an economic problem and I want to figure out how to stop the violence tomorrow, it's got to be an economic solution, right?
Well, let me back up, though, for a minute, because we have all, at some point or another, heard about a shooting or something violent that happened,
Sure.
Maybe even right nearby. And the vast majority of people don't get involved. So why get involved?
I was pissed off. I don't understand how you don't, and that's not a judgment on anyone else at all. But I think as an entrepreneur, you see these crazy problems and you're attracted to them to try and resolve them, or at least understand them, right? And that was all it was.
The gang task force helped George set up an initial meeting with several local gang leaders. At this point, it's important to note that George is an unassuming, white, middle-aged software engineer, so naturally, they all thought he was a cop spearheading an elaborate sting operation. The initial meeting happened at the offices of Untapped, George's latest software company.
That meeting only lasted probably 20 minutes initially, but in the end, it was very clear right away that very day that, the drivers of this stuff's money. Like, it's a lack of opportunity. And so I asked him, I said, so I don't know what's going to happen here, but do you have interest in getting together once a week and let's figure this out and help me understand? And if we can find a path, then we'll move. And that's sort of how I got kicked off.
How does a brewery wind up becoming the foundation of that change?
Well, so TRU Colors was started because of our mission first, not to be a brewery. We knew we wanted to be for profit, partly because of my background and personality, but also because of that of the gangs. And through Untapped, we knew a fair amount about the beer business. I knew a lot of the C-level players at the large retailers. I knew guys in the breweries. And I believe that because of the mission and the story and our network that we could scale really fast, which was important.
So is it about the mission or is it about the product?
So it's really hard to decouple those two things. I think it's really hard because the product doesn't exist without the mission. The world might not need another beer. I mean, what are the odds on a new beer being in the shelf at Harris Teeter, Publix, Whole Foods, Food Lion, and on and on and on? Never. I don't know if it's ever happened. And the reason they want to do that is because they believe strongly in this idea of bringing people together and peace going forward. And so that's the reason people connect with our beer.
In terms of starting up, what was the biggest roadblock you faced?
We believe that violence violence and divisiveness is driven by economic issues and exclusion. And so if that's true, we're going to give economic opportunity to guys that are in gangs. Will street skills convert to corporate skills? I think so, but I don't know, right? And so we ran a whole bunch of tests back, a couple of years ago. For example, we hired 3 guys that were really good at selling stuff on the street. And we hired them into Untapped and put them on the sales team. And then within 3 months, which is the normal ramp for a salesperson, they were all in the top 50% of the group, and one of them was breaking records.
George also used Untapped to run other tests, although he admits the team was just trying to figure it all out. He focused on the influence of gang leaders. He put out the word that he wanted to hire the right people with the right influence on the 1,200 or so gang members in the community, and through them he could influence the rank and file. He paid them all livable wages with benefits, and he put them through a 2-month boot camp, which still exists as part of the TRU Colors onboarding program.
And so he said, come on in, 2 months, and I'm going to judge you on 3 things. 1, can you come in here and be positive, work together? But the guy across the table from him put a bullet in their shoulder just last week, maybe. So this is, it's a heated situation, or could be.
Right.
But anyway, secondly, can you absorb all the knowledge we're going to pour into you? And then third, and probably most important to me, show me that you have the influence. And over the next 2 months, I don't want to see one gang-related shooting in the next 2 months. And now, that sounds like a low bar to me and you, but back in our city, back then, we were seeing 1 to sometimes 2 shootings a week. So it was a big ask. So off we go, and first week is flipping nuts. And so we're in a room maybe half the size of this one with, I think there was 13 people, screaming and yelling, crazy, like out of control, and every curse word and everything. And I was thinking 3 days in, wow, this is just not a good idea. And within another 2 weeks, everyone started getting along again all of a sudden. And then it got better and better and better. And by the end, guys that had been just bitter rivals for years, had they seen each other on a stoplight, they would have broke out with guns, are now going out and having a beer together, and they're friends. And more importantly, at the end of 2 months, nobody got hurt. There was nothing on the street. And so that was another test we did to prove that you can leverage that influence. It shows you how people don't want to do that. And if they see an opportunity, they'll take it.
When you bring somebody on board as an employee at TRU Colors, is there any kind of commitment they have to make to extract themselves from the gang part of their lives?
So all our guys stay in the gang. They don't leave the gang. And frankly, if they did, then we would lose influence, right? That whole theory of leverage and influence would go in. What they do have to commit to, though, is nothing illegal. If I see you jaywalking, you're fired. No bullshit. You're representing TRU Colors here. You're representing our future, your community's future. And if you're not willing to do it, then you need to probably walk out the door right now. But nothing illegal.
9 times out of 10, when George has to let someone go, they actually apologize and want to reapply, which they can do after 90 days. Many of TRU Colors' best players have been through boot camp twice. But it's actually not even that big a problem. TRU Colors has low attrition rates, and most of the people who don't make it through boot camp are cut because they showed up late. George's policy is that if you show up even 1 second late to anything, you're out. It sounds harsh, but it works, especially for a company that only exists to further its mission. And maybe surprisingly, that mission isn't driven solely through brewing and selling beer.
We have probably one of the nicest certainly the nicest recording studio and broadcast studio in North Carolina, maybe the Mid-Atlantic. And that's an important component. It's a separate division within the company, if you would, and their sole job is to make art that promotes the social mission. It just so happens that if we do a really good job of that, we sell beer because people connect with what they're doing. They want to be involved in it. They want to support it, and the beer's good. We have a small team who's active out in the community on the streets. They're very aware of any confrontations that might be bubbling up, and they try to intervene. They're sort of like violence interrupters, you might call them. and they're very involved in that.
One of the artists who works for TRU Colors is a rapper named 1090 Trig, who wrote and rapped a song called Reform.
I know how I feel to be a black man in America, and everybody walking around like they scared of you, and everybody talking down to get ahead of you. Ain't never letting up like you a competitor.
His full-time job, yes, he gets a salary and benefits from TRU Colors, is to create art like this that can touch the community the company exists to influence. And the mission has been effective.
There's roughly 65 guys out there that are affiliated. And each of those guys prior to TRU Colors was a risk to our community. They represent all the gangs in the city. They get along. They're buying houses, buying cars, going on vacation, raising their family. They are good citizens. And our police chief just reported at the end of last year that 2021, which by the way saw a lot of spike in violence in cities around America, right? For 2021 for our city, it was one of the least amount of street violence that I can remember.
Have you ever had anything negative happen? Any bad gang violence at or around the company, the brewery?
Not ever here. I mean, we certainly have had it out in the streets. We've lost friends and team members. I mean, that's honestly one of the hardest parts about working at TRU Colors is that you're always at risk at losing a friend. I mean, that is a fact. Like we've never been able to use our influence to take violence to zero. And that's the difference in TRU Colors. Like in my software companies, if we made a mistake and launched some buggy software, sucks for our customers, sucks for us, but like you can fix that stuff, right? You can't fix some of the things that happen in TRU Colors. If you get involved in companies that have a social mission as challenging as TRU Colors, like it's just incredibly hard on so many levels because there's all these personal relationships, people get hurt. But in some, I mean, so I've never ever in my entire career thought about quitting a startup ever. And I've been through some hard startups. And I've probably thought of quitting TRU Colors at least 3 times. But you know, sometimes I'll look out across this room and you see what's going on out here and you see these folks and I know their kids, I know their wives, I know what they're doing today and I know what they were doing yesterday before they came here. And, you know, that's what makes it worthwhile, right?
I asked George about mission-based entrepreneurism, specifically focused on reducing gang violence.
I've never, ever met an organization that works with active gang members. There are a number of groups that try to reduce street violence, gang violence, but if they work with the gang members, they require that they leave the gang. Most groups that are involved in trying to stop street violence have a 10-year time horizon. We have a 24-hour time horizon. Every day we reset what happened yesterday, what's going to happen tomorrow. Because TRU Colors was started with the question, if we wanted to stop the violence right here, right now, what do? We got to go talk to the dude with a gun, right? They, at a leadership level, are looking for opportunity and are willing to take risk if you can show them a path that's different. And so why wouldn't you work with them and help them grow what they're doing and better what they're doing and use their influence to better their whole group?
We talked about authenticity as a requirement for everything from launching a tech startup to inserting yourself into the upper echelons of gangs. For an otherwise unassuming guy, George has done some pretty gangster shit.
I mean, startups are pretty gangster anyway, right? Even if it's a software startup. They're hard. And you learn how to be direct and authentic and real. Like, there's no bullshit. There can't be, because without authenticity, you can't lead. And you certainly can't lead through challenging times. And so the reason that the gang members responded like they did is, well, I was always authentic. I told them to go F themselves, or I'd say whatever I want when they needed to, and I told them I'd support them when they needed to do that too. I mean, I've been in dark rooms with guns and drugs many, many times. And like, oh, you took all that risk, you could have gotten hurt. Maybe, sure. But think about this. Think about the risk that those guys took, coming to meet some white dude who is like all of a sudden coming into their world and seeing all this stuff, and they over time exposing me to it. I mean, think of that risk.
So what your mission is to remove the situations that cause them to do the bad things.
Yeah, and most of it's economic and exclusion. So like imagine if you grew up as a child and you were told, and you grew up in the project, and you were told that, hey, first of all, school's not really for you. That's kind of a white man's game. Unless you're going to be an athlete, there's no point in even doing anything because no one's going to hire you. You're black. You grow up and you don't have food on the table. You don't have heat all the time. You are sitting in the kitchen and the lights go out and mom's crying right in front of you, and you're a 12-year-old boy, and you can go sell drugs and turn the lights back on, or you can just sit there and watch mom cry. You grow up and you watch your brother get killed right in front of you in some kind of a street dispute. Like, imagine what that does to a human being. And that's not black or white or anything. It's just human.
Right.
The amount of trauma that builds up causes people to withdraw. And then if on top of that, you don't believe you'll ever be included in the good life, so to speak, ever.
All of this gives me a really good sense of how you've helped to change the lives of the people that you employ here. How has it changed your life?
What I've learned is that you really shouldn't judge people's choices until you fully understand their options. But the only options that are really available to any of us are the ones that we believe they are available to us. So, for example, I could have become Tom Brady maybe, right? But I didn't believe I had a shot, so I didn't even try. And it's the same thing. Like, man, if you believe your only option is to become a drug dealer or just forever be impoverished, if you really believe that, then most people are going to become a drug dealer.
What advice would you give to anybody else out there who's considering starting a second act?
The advice I'd give is, one, make sure that's true. You really care about that, because startups are really hard. I don't care. It could be, a restaurant, or it could be something like TRU Colors. It's all really hard. And obviously, if you have some skill in the area or in that space, it's very helpful. When I got into brewing, I knew the beer business. I didn't know anything about brewing. I didn't know anything about engineering a brewery. I mean, it's pretty complicated. Fortunately, I had a lot of smart people that have run to help me. But yeah, all businesses are more complicated than they look like on the surface. So dig in. But it's also very rewarding. Whatever you start, it could be a restaurant, it could be a gym, it could be a crazy big software company, whatever. They're all very rewarding.
George's incredible story exists at the intersection of passion and purpose. Walking through TRU Colors, fist bumping with several of George's employees, and realizing how and why they were all there left an indelible mark on my soul. I was witnessing the product of actual change that saves and improves lives. TRU Colors isn't just a brewery. It's a pirate ship that flies a flag of hope. There are plenty of takeaways I could cover, but I'll leave you with just one that resonates and reverberates for me. We all have something that drives us, and while most of us may not do something on the scale of TRU Colors, finding your purpose will yield undeniably positive results. Andy and I are always on the lookout for new people to profile on Second Act Stories. If you'd like to suggest a candidate, we'd love to hear from you. Just visit our website at www.secondactstories.org and click on the Nominate a Guest box at the top of the homepage. We hope you'll keep listening. There are more Second Act Stories just around the corner.